Ooh, so can I have a film?
Yeah, it's a story.
Shawshank Redemption.
My daughters like to read Beauty and the Beast.
It's probably the Odyssey. I liked it as a child, and I like all the excitement of Polyphemus and Circe's island, and people turn to swine, and his love for Penelope, and Penelope's bed built into the door frame. It's just a very exciting story. It's got everything.
What's my favourite story? It's probably something that I've seen, or related to very recently. I'm watching a lot of K-drama, Korean drama at the moment.
The Lord of the Rings.
Probably some of my favorite books are the William Faulkner novels. I love Faulkner. I don't have probably one favorite book.
The Lord of the Rings.
I mean, I've got lots of sort of stories and books. I mean, obviously, I love the Narnia books and the Lord of the Rings, but I also love, the Arthur Ransom books and the sort of sailing stories and all of that. One of the stories that I'm now turning my attention to in a big way, but that enchanted me as a child and to which I've kept returning all my life, is the great interlacing cycle of stories around King Arthur.
I can't say this is my favorite story, but it's one of my favorite stories, and it has to do with my wonderful British friends in time of crisis, if I could tell it quickly. I'm a huge fan of Winston Churchill, and I'm fully aware of his flaws, but his strengths, I think, really outweighed his weaknesses. And one of the stories I've come across more recently in Andrew Roberts' wonderful biography of Winston Churchill, Walking with Destiny, is you've just endured the evacuation of British and French troops, thousands of them, from Dunkirk. This miraculous deliverance, the Nazis bearing down on you. You escape in all kinds of boats, you get back to the mainland, and it is, as Churchill described it, it really was a colossal military disaster. And what does Winston Churchill do a couple of days after the evacuation at Dunkirk? He instructs members of his team to draw up plans for a cross-channel invasion.
Well, that's easy. Lord of the Rings.
I really like the story of the Wizard of Oz.
I think my favourite story might be The Magician's Nephew by C.S. Lewis, and just the story of creation and Aslan singing and bringing the world into being with his song.
Yeah, I don't know that I have a favorite. It's always hard. People ask me what is my favorite C.S. Lewis book or what's my favorite book in general, and it's always hard for me to know. I think the story that has meant the most for me actually is a biblical story, and that's the story of incarnation.
What's your favourite story?
No clue. Great, friends, if I can butt into the conversations at that point and welcome you very warmly to St Andrews this evening. And whether you're here in the building or whether you're joining us from elsewhere, wherever that may be, you are very welcome indeed. Let me welcome you to this, the fourth and the final of our Lent with the Inklings series. A particularly warm welcome to our creative writers. At the back left, you're very welcome indeed. Those who are on now remind me, the Oxford Centre for Fantasy Writing. Thank you. Well, you're very welcome indeed. I hope you enjoy the evening. It's lovely to have you with us. If we've not met, my name is Paul. I'm on the staff team here at St Andrews. And as ever, I'm going to hand over to Simon Horrobin and Julia Golding, who have both done a lot of thinking and reading and writing about the Inklings and have been sort of curating these evenings, for which we are very thankful indeed. Thank you for all you've contributed over the last 3 weeks. We look forward to what you'll contribute this evening. As we think about the Inklings and their understanding of story and the power of story and why indeed they are so powerful. Thank you, Simon, Julia.
Okay, thanks, Paul, and thank you for that impromptu applause. So in this final session, as Paul said, we're going to think about the place of story in our creative and spiritual lives. The Inklings were a group of Christian writers who met to read out their work in progress because they thought that shared stories, laid open for criticism, made for better ones. And they also believed that stories could change the way that they saw life.
So both Simon and I have a life involved in stories. Simon holds the academic post. Moving across because there we go. Simon holds the academic post that C.S. Lewis himself held at Magdalen, and no doubt you read many stories with your students. And I, as an author and also a teacher of creative writing, spend all my day in the world of stories. But every one of us bring in stories all the time in our life. And I want you to think in the first question to discuss in your group is, have you ever found at a particular moment that you had a really good story to share with somebody? When was that moment that you shared a story that helped? So this is the warm-up. Have a little discussion.
I mean, I can just...
Okay, let's do another sound check. I'm on Kylie mic A, which seems a bit overpowered. Okay. So we're going to think today about going through the wardrobe, the way that stories are used to take us to a new place. And we're starting with something that's become called the Great Conversation. C.S. Lewis lost his childhood faith during the 1910s and spent most of the 1920s as an atheist. Influenced by the skepticism of his era, he saw the dying God narrative just one among many myths of world religions and folklore. Putting the Bible with these, he no longer believed the stories he'd been told as a little boy. In Surprised by Joy, that's his story of his early years, he tells the tale of his return to theism and then to Christianity. A key part of that was to reframe the thought of what a story or myth was. His journey began by coming across a book called Phantastes by George MacDonald in 1916. Lewis writes that in this Victorian fantasy story he found, "I did not yet know, and I was longing to learn, the name of the new quality, the bright shadow that rested on the travels of Anados. I do now. It was holiness."
In conversation with fellow Inklings, like Owen Barfield, Hugo Dyson, and Tolkien, Lewis further changed his mind. In what's become known as the Great Conversation of 1931, so it took place on Addison's Walk at Magdalen after a long dinner. They took a walk round Addison's Walk and then went back to Lewis's rooms in the new buildings and sat there talking till 3 in the morning, Lewis says. He eventually let Tolkien out through the side gate. They had this conversation in which Tolkien challenged Lewis's dismissal of stories as mere fiction and suggested a source for this bright shadow that Lewis had remembered from Phantastes. Tolkien argued that man is a sub-creator. He came from God, and it was from God, therefore, that he drew his ideals. And so this meant that pagan myths were never just lies. There was always something of the truth in them.
And if you want to have a sort of semi-dramatized account of that long conversation Simon was referring to, there's a very good one in the Inklings by Humphrey Carpenter. So Lewis was on a journey. He came to see the dying God stories as forerunners to Jesus, God preparing the way. Here and here only, in all time, the myth must have become fact. It is the summing up and the actuality of them all, he wrote.
This is a journey of a man who found faith through considering myths. But there's something also here for everyone, no matter your faith or no faith perspective. It suggests that we value stories as fragments of truth, no matter what form they arrive in. So we now have a short video that's addressing the question of how does God communicate through story?
I remember one time in my congregation, I told the story about the two disciples on their way going back to Bethany after Christ has died, and they're all forlorn, and he joins them on the road, but they have no idea who it is. And so I was telling this story in a way that we were, right there with them, walking along and going along. And I got to that place where, all of a sudden, he breaks bread at the table. They've invited him to stay. And just in the way he breaks the bread, it dawns on them who this is. And then he disappears. He's gone. and they turn and look at one another, and they put the stuff away and grab their cloaks, and they hightail it back to Jerusalem. But when I told the story, this little girl right near the front said out loud, as only children can, I think it was Jesus. And what a delightful moment, that it caught her, this story, and I hope that will remain with her for her life.
Well, we are story creatures, that our life is over a narrative trajectory of time. And so speaking in story or hearing stories is our being's very way of understanding and of relating and of communicating. And so communicating through story, it's who we are as God's creatures. And so God communicating through a story makes perfect sense. And that's why some of the most powerful passages of the scriptures are narrative, is because we absorb them throughout all of time, regardless of our generation, regardless of which century we live in. We can absorb the same story, even if it's in a slightly different way, because we are created that way. We are narrative inherently, that our lives are from beginning to end a narrative.
I think stories appeal to us because they're memorable and they're applicable. That's why Jesus spoke in parables. We remember stories more than we do exposition or propositional statements. But we also find new layers or levels of applicability. I think about the people who've looked at the story of the prodigal son, for example, and as they have related to different characters in that parable in different times of life or different seasons of life, the story continues to reveal certain things.
The most influential teacher in Western civilization, if not in world civilization, Jesus of Nazareth. And his favorite teaching tool is, of course, the story. That's his pedagogical method, is the story. So when Jesus wanted to communicate something about the relentless love of God for people, whoever those people are, however lost they are, he tells three stories in succession. The woman who's lost her precious coin, the shepherd who's lost a sheep, and the father who's lost his son, the prodigal son. And he told those stories 2,000 years ago in a language we don't know. And yet it is part of our mental makeup, the story of the prodigal son and the love of God communicated through that story. So immensely powerful medium, isn't it? It's just remarkable. We seem to be hardwired to respond to storytelling in a way we don't to other things, other modes of communication.
There's one sense in which God must communicate himself to us in story, because we are creatures of story. We become who we are, in a sense, by constantly telling to ourselves the story of our lives. We're born into a narrative and a sequence, and that's how we become persons. And we become persons not only by telling our own stories, but working out gradually how we fit into somebody else's stories. And then if we're lucky, realizing that there's a much bigger story of which we're part. So I think actual selfhood and personhood is, for us, the medium in which we experience that is story.
Okay, so we're ready for some more questions, I hope. And we're going to think of ourselves as the sub-creators of these stories. And it's some quite easy questions. I gave you some really tough ones last week, I remember. This is the easy week. The first question is, what are your favorite stories and why? And then what happens when you create and tell stories? There are some people here who are actually here to do writing, so they're totally going to ace that part. But everybody here has sat down and told a story to a friend. So what happens when you do that? What do you do to the experience when you put it into a story? Tell the group. Off you go.
Okay, that's probably long enough. I'll be interested to know. I'll be interested to find out what people's favourite stories are later. I hope at least somebody has gone for one of the Narnia stories. So, thinking about stories and how Lewis and Tolkien came to write their own stories, we thought it would be helpful to read a little section of an essay that C.S. Lewis wrote when he was asked how it was he came to write The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. So I'm just going to read that little extract and then talk a little bit about it. So it's called It All Began with a Picture. The editor has asked me to tell you how I came to write The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. I will try, but you must not believe all that authors tell you about how they wrote their books. We have to bear that in mind when Julia starts telling us about how she writes. A good one for all the creatives as well. This is not because they mean to tell lies. It's because a man writing a story is too excited about the story itself to sit back and notice how he is doing it. In fact, that might stop the works. Just as, if you start thinking about how you tie your tie, the next thing is you find you can't tie it. And afterwards, when the story is finished, he's forgotten a good deal of what writing it was like. One thing I am sure of, all my 7 Narnian books and my 3 science fiction books began with seeing pictures in my head. At first, they were not a story, just pictures. The Lion all began with a picture of a fawn carrying an umbrella and parcels in a snowy wood. This picture had been in my mind since I was about 16. Then one day, when I was about 40, I said to myself, let's try to make a story about it. At first, I had very little idea how the story would go. But then suddenly, Aslan came bounding into it. I think I had been having a good many dreams of lions about that time. Apart from that, I don't know where the lion came from or why he came. But once he was there, he pulled the whole story together, and soon he pulled the 6 other Narnian stories in after him. So you see that, in a sense, I know very little about how this story was born. That is, I don't know where the pictures came from. And I don't believe anyone knows exactly how he makes things up. Making up is a very mysterious thing. When you have an idea, could you tell anyone exactly how you thought of it? So it's not very helpful, I guess, is it, as a method, if you're trying to teach somebody how to be a creative writer. But I think it is very intriguing, in the sense, particularly, of the way in which he thinks that the stories are coming from something outside of himself. For him, it's pictures. For Tolkien, it was words. Middle-earth began with an invented language. As a boy, he was particularly taken with the Welsh names on the steam engines that came from Wales, carrying coal to his native home in Birmingham. And he was greatly influenced by languages. He discovered Welsh at an early age and loved the sound of Welsh. And when he then came to Oxford to study classics, became interested in Finnish, purely for those euphonic reasons as well. He loved the sound of the language. In fact, spent much of his first year inventing his own languages based on Welsh and Finnish, and as a result didn't do terribly well in his first year exams in classics. But luckily he did do well in comparative philology. He discovered Gothic and discovered he was a brilliant philologist, essentially. And so his tutor sensibly pointed out he might do better to switch to English, where he could actually study these as part of his degree. And in his second year, he encountered an Anglo-Saxon poem called Christ. It was a translation of a Latin antiphon. And when he read the opening 2 lines of it, he was particularly struck They go like this. Eala earendel engla beochtost. Over midden jaard monum sended. And just in case your Old English isn't quite up to scratch, I should maybe tell you what that means. It's O Earendel, brightest of angels, over Middle-earth to men sent. You probably even noticed in the Old English the word midden Eard, Middle-earth. You know, it's an Old English term, and Tolkien borrowed it. But it was particularly that name, Earendel, that struck him. It's a greeting to the bright morning star, Earendel, the brightest of angels. And he says, having encountered that line, I felt a curious thrill, as if something had stirred in me, half wakened from sleep. There was something very remote and strange and beautiful behind these words, if I could grasp it, far beyond ancient English. And from that, he wrote a poem about Earendel. He made him a mariner, a sailor, who was a star, who sailed across the sky, and then when the dawn came and the sun came out, he disappeared. And this really was the beginning of his whole mythology, or legendarium, as Tolkien scholars call it. And after he'd written this poem about Earendel, he showed it to a friend of his, a fellow student at Corpus called G.B. Smith, who had been at school with Tolkien and was also a budding poet. And he showed it to him, and G.B. Smith said, it's a good poem, I like it, but what's it about? And Tolkien, his response, I think, was, again, very intriguing. He says, I don't know. I'll try to find out. And it strikes me as quite similar to Lewis in that regard, that he doesn't see himself as inventing things or making things up, but more discovering things, finding out about things that are already there. And as I've said, central to this was the invented languages. These come first. He invented a language, and then he thought, well, who would have spoken this language, and what kind of mythology would have grown up around their society? And so words were made flesh by thinking of who might have spoken these invented tongues. And we can see the development in this, in the way that that one line from that Old English Christ poem, Eala Earendel engla beachtost, comes back in various forms, both in the Silmarillion and again in the Lord of the Rings. And if you can remember, there's an episode in the Lord of the Rings when Frodo and Sam are caught in Shelob's lair. Do you remember Shelob? It's that huge, unpleasant spider. And they're in the pitch black. They can't see, and they're aware of this thing. And at that point, Frodo suddenly remembers that Galadriel gave him a star glass which could help them if they were ever stuck in the darkness. It's a light for dark places. And without even knowing what it means, he finds himself exclaiming, Aya Earendil Elenion and Kalima, which again, if you're Elvish, isn't quite up to scratch, means it's essentially a translation of that same Old English line, Earendil. With a slight change, it means, O Earendil, brightest of stars, rather than brightest of angels. But again, we can see how Tolkien's coming back to that line throughout his writing of this legendarium. And so Julia's going to come now and read us an extract from a poem that Tolkien wrote called Mythopoeia, myth-making.
He actually wrote this as part of his conversation that he was having with C.S. Lewis, and he prefaces it with just a little bit of prose. He says, "We have come from God, and inevitably the myths woven by us, though they contain error, will also reflect a splintered fragment of the true light, the eternal truth that is with God. And this is just a little bit of quite a long poem. The heart of man is not compound of lies, but draws some wisdom from the only wise, and still recalls him. Though now long estranged, man is not wholly lost, nor wholly changed. Disgraced he may be, yet is not dethroned, and keeps the rags of lordship once he owned. His world dominion by creative act, not his to worship the great artifact, man's sub-creator, the refractive light, through whom is splintered from a single white to many hues and endlessly combined in living shapes that move from mind to mind. Though all the crannies of the world we filled with elves and goblins, though we dared to build gods and their houses out of dark and light, and sow the seed of dragons, 'twas our right, used or misused. The right has not decayed. We make still by the law in which we're made. So there's quite a lot to unpack in that. But just to draw your attention to this idea that we make still by the law in which we're made, i.e. we were made by God and therefore we go on in his image to make. And that's at the heart of the idea of being a sub-creator. So just before we hear from our experts, have a little chat in your groups to respond to what you've just heard about the origins of story from Lewis and Tolkien, and this idea that by being made in the image of a creator God, we are sub-creators. Just give you a few moments to absorb. Okay, so we're now going to have some thoughts from our experts. Just to give you a bit of context, you've been seeing the same people week by week. So I'm just going to recap at the other end of our course who they all are. We've got Reverend Stanley Hanna from Canada, who is a Presbyterian minister, but he also teaches at Theological College on Tolkien. We've got Lisa Koutras, who used to come to this church, by the way. Some of you might recognize her. But she has done a doctoral thesis on Tolkien and beauty. We've got the fabulous Diana Glyer, who's a professor over in the States, who's an expert on the Inklings. We have Joseph LeConte, who's also an expert academic over in the States, who has particularly written about Tolkien and Lewis and the First World War. And of course, we have Malcolm Guite, who is the one who looks like a hobbit, poet, academic, general extraordinary person, but a Tolkien and Lewis expert as well. So they are going to help you shape your thoughts.
Yes, we make because we are made, and we create because we're made in the image of a creator, that it is inherently part of our genetic makeup, our spiritual makeup. We are created in the image of a creator, that is part of the imago Dei, that we must create because we can't help it. It's who we are as God's creatures. And when I was first reading the Silmarillion, the creation story, after the world is created, you see that the Valar, the angelic beings, go into the world and begin to create their own things. And it's not that they're creating out of nothing, because they can't. They don't have the secret fire or the flame imperishable. That is only with the creator. But they can take that which he created and fashion it into something beautiful. And just like that, we also can take things and fashion them into something beautiful, that we can be redemptive in this world, regardless of our occupation, regardless of whether we're artists or some other career path. We can make beautiful things. We can come up with beautiful results because we're made in his image. We create because we're made in the image of a creator.
I think he's right. I think it's very important, though, to notice the sub as well as the creator. I think he does want to say that only God creates ex nihilo. I think Lewis was much more wary of this stuff. I think that's all in the difference between The Great Divorce on the one hand and Leaf by Niggle. The painter in The Great Divorce is basically told not to paint in heaven because it's all there. Whereas Niggle is precisely told to paint, that his career, there's a much more finally and fully and utterly redeemed positive role for creativity in the new creation in Tolkien. I don't think Lewis would quite let himself go there, but I think I'm sure he's there now.
Yeah, I was looking over it again recently, and he's very explicit about we make up stories because we're made in the image of a creator, a maker himself. So there is a theological basis that Tolkien ascribes to this. And we can't seem to forget that. We can't seem to pretend it's not who we are. We do it so instinctively and naturally. It just seems to be woven into human nature. And that creative aspect that we have, it's an amazing gift, it seems to me, that God has given us. And so when we are engaged in it in a way that is honest and vigorous, then I think there's an intimation there of something of the divine, something transcendent. At its best, I think that's what it can do.
You might be familiar with Dorothy Sayers and her book, The Mind of the Maker. And she emphasizes that in the book of Genesis, when God says, let us make human beings in our own image, what God has been up to that time, that identifying activity of God before that declaration, let us make human beings in our own image. The main thing that God's been doing is making things. So God is a creator. God makes things out of nothing, and we function as sub-creators. We make things out of the things that God has made.
Sorry, we were just having a decision to cut the next question for time reasons, but we were going to ask you where you express your own creativity. it was really going towards the idea that not everyone here is a creative writer, but you might do gardening or baking or decorating your house or the way you teach your students. All of this is about being creative. So moving on from this theme, I want to look at creativity and free will. So there's a really fascinating new book out of Tolkien's writings. It's called The Nature of Middle-earth. It's been collected, fragments of his work collected posthumously. And though it's probably something only the really dedicated Tolkien enthusiast is going to read, in there is lots of little nuggets of fascinating material. And this is Tolkien talking about comparing the author to the creator. It's page 230 if someone has the book at home. And he's thinking about the nature of free will. The author is not in the tale in one sense, yet it all proceeds from him and what was in him, so that he may be present all the time. Now, while composing the tale, he may have certain general designs, the plot, for instance, and he may have a clear conception of the character, independent of a particular tale, of each feigned actor. But those are the limits of his foreknowledge. Many authors have recorded the feeling that one of their actors comes alive, as it were, and does things that were not foreseen at all at the outset, and may modify in a small or even a large way the process of the tale thereafter. All such unforeseen actions or events are, however, taken up to become integral parts of the tale when finally concluded. Now, when that has been done, then the author's foreknowledge is complete, and nothing can happen, be said or done, that he does not know of and will or allow to be. Now, I just want to, before we talk about the vexed issue of allegory, I just want to say that that is absolutely the heart of the experience of writing. If ever you've wondered what it's like to be a writer, in fact, we were even talking about it in the seminar we had today in the class I was running, that when you create something, there is a moment when what you create takes on a life of its own. I imagine that this is reflected in musical composition and in painting and all sorts of other arts. And what Tolkien is doing there is saying, think of that experience. That might be how we, as the creation of God, work when he's looking at us, which I think is a fascinating explanation for free will. Anyway, so we are now going to talk about the nature of allegory, because this is one of the key story terms in studies of the Inklings. And I'm going to start batting some questions at Simon. So first of all, Simon, can you tell us something of Tolkien's view of allegory and whether he thought of the Narnian stories as allegories?
So I think that's an interesting question, because modern critics so often dismiss the Narnia stories as mere allegories. We tend not to particularly like that form today, and often they're seen as books that sort of sneak in the Christian faith in this slightly underhand way. But Lewis himself was quite resistant against this idea, and he knew what he was talking about. He knew what allegory was. His first academic book was The Allegory of Love, which was an extended study of the medieval allegorical love poem. And in it, he explains what an allegory is. It was a form that was very popular and influential throughout medieval Europe. And it's pretty obvious, looking at what Lewis says here, that the Narnia stories are not allegories in that sense. So, they're stories in which characters represent ideas like danger or pride or conscience or reason, and somebody goes on a journey and encounters these particular ideas as human characters. And when Lewis first converted to Christianity, he actually wrote a story exactly of this type. It was obviously influenced by a particularly famous example, that is John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, and he wrote a book called The Pilgrim's Regress. And it's a series of dream visions narrating this character called John, who is trying to leave his hometown of Puritania to get to this beautiful island. And along the way, he meets all kinds of allegorical guides like Reason or Enlightenment or Mr. Sensible, who sounds like a character out of a Roger Hargreaves novel. But of course, one of the reasons why allegory is such a limiting medium is because, even in a Roger Hargreaves novel, Mr. Worry can make a list of all his worries, and he doesn't worry in the end. But Mr. Sensible can't change. He's a complete cardboard cutout figure. And that was one of the reasons why I think Lewis was quite opposed to this idea of allegory.
So what was he doing in the Narnia stories?
Well, one term that he does use of them is a supposal. So what he meant by that was, it was a kind of thought experiment. He was trying to, in The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, answer the question, hypothetical question, what might Christ become like if there really were a world like Narnia, and he chose to be incarnate and die and rise again in that world as he actually has done in ours. And so, obviously there is some kind of similarity here between what I've described as allegory and what Lewis is doing here, in the sense that Aslan is obviously a figure of Christ coming into Narnia and freeing it through his self-sacrifice and resurrection. But again, there's all kinds of other differences too, aren't there? We talked about these a few weeks ago. When he does so, as the deeper magic starts to wane, Father Christmas turns up, which seems a little bit anachronistic. And then, of course, there are these other mythical creatures who turn up, the naiads, the dryads, the fauns, and so on, the classical mythology, the Norse mythology, characters from Beowulf are there. You can't explain it in that consistent way that you can with an allegory. It's one of the things that frustrated Tolkien about it so much, was that it wasn't so sort of self-consistent as Middle-earth. But I think it shows, in a way, how resistant Lewis was to that simple definition.
Thank you. So, shall we have a look at Tolkien and allegory? I'm going to actually refer to the man himself, because this was such an issue for Tolkien and the way his own stories were understood that he actually put it in the preface of Lord of the Rings. He doesn't pull his punches. I cordially dislike allegory in all its manifestations and always have done so since I grew old and wary enough to detect its presence. I much prefer history, true or feigned, with its varied applicability to the thought and experience of readers. I think that many confuse applicability with allegory, but the one resides in the freedom of the reader and the other in the purposed domination of the author. And he was pushing back on the idea that people were saying, oh, clearly the ring is a nuclear bomb, and Mordor is clearly Nazi, rise of Nazi Germany. But applicability means that you are free to apply those terms. And I've noticed in the current Ukrainian conflict, for example, that they are referring to Russia as Mordor, and it's being applied in that context. So it's a very fresh and current application of a story, which isn't allegory at all. And then I suppose the other thing that sometimes happens is certain storylines are questioned, and the one that we're going to end on is Gandalf. Now, Gandalf dies and comes back again. So is this Jesus? Well, no. We've actually circled back to Addison's Walk and that story in The Great Conversation. This is a version of the dying God story, sort of muted and changed to be about a wizard. It's Tolkien giving a little glimmer, a splinter of light, a fragment that reflects back on the central story, which is, of course, the Easter story. We're coming towards the end of Lent, and we're going to hand over now to Paul to hear about the Easter story.
Thank you. We'll get to the Easter story, but first, I wonder if you have ever wondered why the Bible is so long. Perhaps you've contemplated that as you've thought about setting yourself the task of reading it in a year, and then opened up and seen that it's well over 1,200 pages, at least it is if you're using the Bibles that we have here. If you presented the Bible as a series of key truths about God and about us, with a list of ethical commands and perhaps a paragraph giving us an ethical guideline by which to make decisions in life, I think you could essentially summarize the Scripture's teaching in, 10, 12 pages maybe. Perhaps not quite as concise as Bridge to Life or Four Spiritual Laws, but closer to that than to the near 1,300 pages that we have here. Why is the Bible so long? And I think the answer, at least in part, as we've been thinking about this evening, is that it is because God is a storyteller. We live in an authored world. God created, and he speaks to and acts in and through human history, in his interaction with people and places, time and spaces, in order to tell an unfolding story. It is the true capital T story through which he makes himself known to us. It is a story in which God, and not us, is the central character. And the Scriptures not only are the way God reveals himself to us, but they're also the way by which he makes us known to us, who we are, what is our meaning and purpose and place in his world and his story for it. It's the true story by which we are to make sense of our world. The good news being, of course, that being authored, there is a sense to be made of our world. We discover very early on in the story that we were created to be proactive partners and participants with the author of creation, participants in advancing his plans and purposes for the world. And to that end, as we've thought a little this evening, he made us in his image. And that is to say, we all bear something of the image of the master author. And so it is little surprise that humans have always been drawn to stories. So again, if we've got the PowerPoint, and I'm going to have to take it on trust because I can't see it on that screen. But my first PowerPoint slide is, I think, Tolkien, who said, "Fantasy remains a human right. We make in our measure and in our derivative mode because we are made. And not only made, but made in the image and likeness of a maker." And so we're naturally storytellers. And of course, as the Inklings argued, one often finds in the great old stories echoes and shadows of God's true story of the world, because we're made in his image. And this understanding played, as we heard, quite a large part in Lewis's conversion, as Hugo Dyson and Tolkien explained how the great myths of dying gods and reviving gods who wrought great deeds that so resonated with Lewis were more than simply empty fiction, which is what he assumed them to be. And that the reason that Lewis felt them to have, and I quote him, profound and suggestive meanings beyond my grasp, even though I could not say in cold prose what it meant, well, the reason they had that was because they reflected, albeit in a distorted and twisted form, something of God's true story that resonates because we're made in his image. And Lewis goes on to say, now the story of Christ is simply a true myth. A myth working on us in the same way as the others, but with this tremendous difference that it really happened. Lewis realizes that those myths that he read in the past resonated and were suggestive because they were shadows of the true, substantial story of Christ that could be truly believed and lived by because it and it alone was grounded on the historical realities of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. We enjoy stories because they have the power to inform and to transform us. So that next quote from Glyn Harrison, a psychiatrist, he says this: stories have the ability to grab people's attention, connect with their emotions, and open them up to the possibility of change. We internalize stories better than facts. Stories engage our imaginations and thereby change our affections and our wills. Stories invite our participation in a way that is transformative. And again, that doesn't surprise the Christian. We were created by God to be formed by his story. And that's why we find stories so formational. Through God's interaction with people and places, through the lives and failures, the successes, tragedies, and joys of the people of faith articulated in the scriptures, God speaks to us in a way that connects emotionally and relationally with us and invites and encourages our participation in his story for us and his world. And since we're created to be formed by God's story and to participate in God's story, it's no surprise that we naturally view life as a story. So the philosopher Charles Taylor makes the point that no one lives life according to a set of bare propositional truths. Rather, we weave every event of our lives into an ongoing story of our lives and the world in which we live that we construct as we grow older. Through that story, sometimes it's known as a worldview, we interpret the things that happen to us, the circumstances and the events of life, and we decide how we should act and respond in the light of them. The story that we construct gives us our actions and our directions and our meaning. Unfortunately, we read at the beginning of the scriptural story of humanity's ongoing decision to abandon God's story for us and to construct our own, one in which we, rather than God, are the supreme author of our lives and hero. We naturally construct our own stories about ourselves and the world in which we live, where meaning is to be found, identity, what constitutes the good life, and so on. And so we cut ourselves off from our supreme author, who is the author of life. We were not authored to live by these stories that we construct, and so they damage us. We misinterpret life because we interpret it through the lens of the wrong story. The way to life and the way on in the life God would have for us is to allow the greater story that God speaks to displace the lesser destructive stories that our culture speaks. It is to let God, who is the supreme author of life, back in as the active author of our lives, rather than trying to author them ourselves. And so God frees us as we increasingly internalize his good story for us and his world, as we make his story for us our story for us. And then we are able to interpret the events of life and give meaning to our life in the right way, in a life-giving way, as we do so through the lens of his story. As we do that, our lives are increasingly shaped and transformed by his story. We do that, of course, as we read the scriptures as a narrative, a story, a true story. Here's a quote from one Bible scholar, Walter Moberly. He says, "The value of reading biblical narrative as story lies in recognizing and appreciating material that appeals to the imaginative and intuitive side of the human mind, where symbolism, suggestion, stimulation, and enjoyment may be of greater importance than argument, appeal, and explicit proclamation." Yes, there's a place for those, but most of the Bible, that is communicated through the medium of story, because it's story that forms and informs. And so we come to the events of Good Friday and Easter Sunday, which we're soon to celebrate, and we come to them as the great climactic moments in God's true story for us and for his world. They are the great turning point moment in his story, the great consolation to which other happy endings in great myths are but a shadow. Tolkien famously said this, and again I think I've got it on a slide, talking about fairy stories, these great myths of the past that they were so drawn to, so resonated with them. So the consolation of fairy stories, the joy of the happy ending, is not essentially escapist. In its fairy tale setting, it is a sudden and miraculous grace. It does not deny the existence of what he calls discatastrophe. That is to say, it doesn't deny sorrow and failure. What it denies, the happy ending, in the face of much evidence, if you will, is universal final defeat. And so far is Evangelium, good news, giving a fleeting glimpse of capital J joy, joy beyond the walls of the world. And he goes on to say, "I concluded by saying that the resurrection was the greatest eucatastrophe," that is, turning point, good news out of catastrophe, possible, and produces that essential emotion, Christian joy. Do you see? Those happy endings that we so delight and so resonate with us are glimpses of the great happy ending that we see in reality in the historical events of the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. If we're to experience the full joy and transforming power of Easter, we need to be struck afresh by the miraculous, gracious, sudden hope that crashes into our world in the events of the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Victory brought out of seeming defeat. How often you see that, particularly in Lord of the Rings. One writer said this: "The best and most compelling stories have high stakes and astonishing, unexpected resolutions." If that is the case, there has never been a greater story than this, and he's referring to the Christian faith. The stakes are literally cosmic. Everyone and everything is at stake. It seems impossible that God could be true to himself, fully good and loving, but fully righteous and just, and still save us, knowing that humanity by nature has rejected him and his story for us. It seems, he says, impossible that after all we have done, there should be any hope. And yet hope comes in the seemingly most unlikely way. The divine author of life steps into human history as one of us. And as sinful humanity and as the supernatural forces that oppose God strike him dead, he wins the possibility of new life for humanity. He breaks the power of the lie that life is not found in our Creator but in created things. He breaks our slavery to self, and he offers the reconciliation with the God of life by dying the death that our killing of him deserved. And as the author of life, death could not hold him. He rose, and now he reigns. And he continues to advance God's story for his people and his world towards its culmination, when at last all is made right, and God's people live forever face to face with him. And in the meantime, he invites everyone to embrace him and his good story for them and the world, the true life-giving story for which we are created, by which we make best sense of our lives and our world. The story that culminates with our being face to face forever with our author. God, give us the grace to grasp it afresh, or perhaps indeed for the first time, this Easter time. Amen. Well, friends, that brings us to the close of our evening, and indeed to this series of 4 Lent with the Inklings evenings. And once again, I want to give huge thanks to all those involved, but in particular Simon and Julia, for all they have contributed, all they have helped put together, the interviews that they have so sort of tirelessly put together and curated and edited down for our evenings. A lot of work, I know, but we are hugely appreciative. Thank you so much. And shall we thank them in the usual way? Thank you to all you who have attended, both here and elsewhere online. And I hope that has been illuminating and spiritually edifying too.